preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Nothing has changed. The size of the group is large, and yet the outsider is still as the Greek of the barbarian. He is still outside of humanity. Then the world cycle, the Roman Empire, the Roman Empire, the Muslim Empire, and still the outsider is the one who is not part of humanity. There are 2 centuries in which perhaps the human race has reached the peak of a sense of humanism, and that is the 13th century and the 18th century, in which there was, as I shall try to show later, a remarkable sense of the bond between all men, and a remarkable feeling for what humanity is. And actually, this is one of the tragic ironies of history, at least of Western history, that at the very moment when men seem to have reached the possibility for the realization of man, of humanity, namely in the French Revolution, at that very moment, the revolution and its consequences, which was born out of the ideas of the philosophers of the 18th century, stops the development. Since the French Revolution, the Western world, and now Asia and Africa and the whole world are celebrating a revival of nationalism, which is in the sharpest contrast to the sense of universality which the 13th and the 18th century were beginning to breed. Of course, we had a League of Nations which died. We still have the United Nations. But we must not forget that the League of Nations, the United Nations, are assemblies of representatives of nations, of national governments. They are not representatives of mankind. Indeed, we face a problem today. The problem is that for the first time in history, in human history, one world is forming, in the process of being formed, by communication, by the same style of life, by the total industrialization of the world. But so far, this one world exists only in terms of common features, in terms of communication, and in fact the chances are that mainly this one world exists in the sense that it's one potential battlefield. That the destruction of one part of the world will lead to the destruction of the total world. I believe that while the idea of one man was in the minds of many people in previous centuries, if this one world is not to be a battlefield, it requires a new man, a man whose loyalty is primarily to mankind and not to a specific state or a specific nation, and a man who can feel himself as a member of the human race and can know what it is to be human. I want now to speak first about the development of the idea of humanity, of what is human, of the oneness of man. And I want to state first that there is a very significant relationship between this idea of humanity. Now, I want to remind you, we have a difficulty in words here, which is particularly great in the English language, because humanity is humankind, but what we are talking here, the Latin humanitas or the German Menschlichkeit, refers not to the totality of men, but refers to the quality which is the essence of this humanity. Hence, I'm using here humanity in a twofold sense, or anybody who uses it has to do so, namely mankind or humankind and that which is essential for mankind and humankind. I was going to say, there is an important event in the history of mankind which happened between 1500 BC and about 500 BC, and that is a great religious revolution which resulted in the concept of one God, or, if you please, one no God. Now, I don't mean to be mysterious. The point is that in the Near East, in Egypt, under Akhenaton, in Palestine, there was a concept of one God, and in China and India, there was no concept of God. There was one no God. But what all these religions had in common was the negation of idols, the negation of the worship of man's own hands, the negation of worshipping the manifoldness of phenomena and submitting oneself to them as against the concept of the basic unity, which in some religions has found the expression of one God as a unifying principle behind the reality of all existence. It is important to see that in these, let me say, anti-idolatric religions, whether that's Buddhism or Taoism or Judaism or Christianity, that in all these concepts you find the idea of the oneness of man. Clearly you see it in Buddha's teaching. Buddha does not talk about Indians. Buddha talks about the problem of human existence. One day he sees what many other people see. He sees a sick man, an old man, and a corpse. But what always distinguishes a genius from all of us is that he sees something and he's surprised, while most of us see things that we are not surprised. And so he asks himself the question, what then is the problem of human existence? And the answer is that the problem of human existence is that we suffer with necessity unless we succeed in overcoming the thirst, in overcoming the greed, in what in Christianity would be called slaying ourselves, forgetting our ego, and waking up fully to the illusion of our separateness from all sentient beings. Buddha did not speak about nations, about various fields of religion. The Buddha spoke about man and the basic problem of his existence, which is the same for all men, and the ways to solve this problem. In the Old Testament you find the same. One man and one woman are created. The Talmud makes an interesting comment on this. He asks, why did God create only one man? And the answer is, for one reason, because he wanted to show that no man can say, I'm superior to you, because my ancestors have been stronger or better than you. And for another reason, because he wanted to show that anyone who saves one human life has saved all of humanity. And everyone who destroys one human life has destroyed all of humanity. Because one man, one individual, indeed is all of man. The Old Testament speaks about man being created in the likeness of God. And in the prophetic messianism, we find not only the concept of peace, we find not only the concept of harmony between man and nature, we find the overcoming, the idea of the overcoming of the sense of distance and difference between the various nations. Let me read you a sentence from Amos and a sentence from Isaiah. Amos says in chapter 9, verse 7, Are you not as children of the Ethiopians unto me, O children of Israel, says the Lord? Have I not brought up Israel out of the land of Egypt, and the Philistines from Caphtor, and the Syrians from Kir? And Isaiah says, in that day shall there be a highway out of Egypt to Assyria, and the Assyrian shall come into Egypt, and the Egyptian to Assyria, and the Egyptians shall serve with the Assyrians. On that day shall Israel be the third with Egypt and with Assyria, a blessing in the midst of the land, whom the Lord of hosts shall bless, saying, Blessed be Egypt, my people, and Assyria the work of my hands, or Israel mine inheritance. If you consider that these words were spoken in the times of the fierce nationalism, in the times in which these three peoples mentioned were the enemies of the prophet who speaks for Israel here, you can get perhaps an idea of the depth of the sense of human unity which is expressed here. And perhaps I could tell you another story from the Talmud, which is, I'm sure, known to many of you. I think it's the last day of the Passover, in which, according to the tradition, the Egyptians drowned in the sea. And when they did drown, then the angels came and wanted to sing the triumphant hallelujah songs, because according to the Talmud, the angels, of course, were on the side of the Hebrews. And God said, how can you dare to sing a song of jubilation when my children have died? When my children have perished. Here again you have the very same spirit hundreds of years after these words were written of the prophet, by the prophet. There is another element which is important to see in the Old Testament, which refers to the concept of humanity. The Old Testament says, love thy neighbor. That is not too well known. Most people think the Old Testament is only a book of revenge, and that this is New Testament teaching. But the Old Testament says something which is terribly important for the problem which we are talking about here. The Old Testament says, love the stranger, because you have been strangers in Egypt, and you know the soul of the stranger. Now, what is so important here is the concept of the stranger. And the great philosopher Hermann Cohen has written a great deal about in a very remarkable book. The concept of the stranger is precisely the concept of the person who is human but who does not belong to your tribe, who is not familiar to you, who has not eaten the same food, sang the same songs, and spoken the same language, because that's practically all there is to it, to the warm stable in which people, they feel safe. The stranger speaks another language, he sings other songs, and he eats other food. And the Old Testament develops the idea, namely, not only to love the neighbor, that is a man who belongs to the same tribe, who is familiar to you, but to love the stranger, which is a man who is any human being who is not part of your tribe and part of your family, who is not familiar to you. And of course, it's very important to notice here that the statement in the Old Testament is, you love the stranger because you have been strangers, and hence you know the soul of the stranger. We know nothing about our neighbor, we know nothing about anyone, unless we feel his experience, unless we can, in our imagination and our feeling, put ourselves where he is. Otherwise, we may be psychologists, but we will know nothing about another man. If we only know clever words to talk about him, and are not in his place, to put it in biblical terms, unless we have been in Egypt, we know nothing about how anyone feels who is a stranger. And there are many kinds of Egypts. Now, naturally, the idea of humanism then has continued in the New Testament. There you have the idea which goes beyond the love of the stranger, namely the idea of the law of the enemy. Now actually there is no basic difference, I believe, because once you have the full experience of humanity, there is no more enemy. There is no one to hate. Because the enemy is you. Because every other person is you. Now this may sound to some of you like a poetic statement. I don't mean it as a poetic statement at all. I think it's one of the fundamental realities. You have this idea of the universality of man and of humanity develops from early Christianity to the late Middle Ages, and you find, for instance, in the late Middle Ages, one of the great Christian thinkers, Nicholas of Cusa, who believes that the humanity of Christ becomes the bond of the world and the highest proof of its inner unity. That is to say, for him, the very fact that in Christian theology Christ is human means is almost, you might say, the guarantee that whoever experiences Christ as human experiences the oneness of humanity, the unity of all men. Well, and of course, then you have the Catholic Church, which represents indeed the idea of universality, which represents indeed the idea of supranationality of the one man who is created in the likeness of God. At this point, something happens, namely Protestantism comes and allies itself with states, and there begins a fight between, a conflict between the supranational idea of the Catholic Church and the support of worldly power by Protestant Church. But this is a very complex topic which I shall not enter into because it would lead too far, and it is not necessary really for us to discuss it in detail. But I do want to point out to another phenomenon which is very important in this development, and that is the idea of natural law, which you find in Western thinking from the Greeks until more or less the beginning of the end of the 18th century. I hope some of you have read or will read Antigone, Sophocles' Antigone, and there of course you have the clearest concept of what natural law is and what humanity is. In Antigone, the idea is the conflict between state-made law, and in fact man-made law, and the law which springs from humanity, from man's natural concern with his neighbor and the stranger. Well, I will just mention briefly what the conflict there is. Antigone's brother has rebelled against Creon, the dictator. He has been killed, and Creon refuses to have him buried, which in Greek thinking was the worst humiliation to be done to any human being. And Antigone is not willing to accept the inhumanity of state-man law, and she dies protesting against Creon. And when she's asked in the name of which law she is opposing the king, she says, "Not of today nor yesterday is this the law, but ever has it life, and no man knows whence it came and how." This is one of the most dramatic or beautiful definitions of what is natural law. The law of humanity, the law which forbids somebody to obey a state-man law. Indeed, the case of Creon and Antigone is not so different from the case of Hitler and Eichmann. Eichmann obeyed the law of the state, and he violated the law of humanity. It is very easy for us to sit in judgment of Eichmann and to say this man is incarnation of evil. But we might better ask ourselves, are we any better than Eichmann? Are we, when confronted with a choice, willing to defy the law of the state when it opposes the law of humanity? I wish most of us could say that. But at least Eichmann might make us think about the problem than simply being individual, rather than simply being individual. Heraclitus, about the same time, speaks of the natural law, and he calls it the divine laws, the divine reason by which all human laws are nourished. That is to say, only inasmuch as human law is nourished by reason, and that is by that which is common to all men, is it a legitimate law. Well, then you have the formulation in a less poetic and more philosophical style, as a natural law is formulated by Cicero when he says, we must now conceive of this whole universe as one commonwealth of which both gods and men are members. Imagine the radicalism of this idea of, at the time of Cicero, of conceiving the whole universe as one commonwealth, not of the Roman Empire, but of the whole universe as one commonwealth of which both gods and men are members. The idea of the natural law is, of course, to be found with the Church Fathers and Thomas Aquinas, and as I said before, by and large, by 1800, it is dismissed as a relic of the Middle Ages. Although another point can be made here, that the idea of natural rights, the natural rights of man, which we find then in the American Constitution, and which we find even today in certain laws of the United Nations, that this idea in many ways grows out of the idea of natural law, but that again is a somewhat complex point. Harold Lasky has written some very interesting things precisely about that. In the Renaissance, we find a concept of man which in many ways grows out of the late Middle Ages, and in many ways it's different. It's the idea of humanity, of humanitas, which interprets man in his natural suchness. That is to say, which accepts man as a natural being he is. And the idea of this period, of this Renaissance concept of man, is, to put it briefly, the many-sided, all-rounded, and even realization of our humanity in the individual. The aim is the realization of our humanity in the individual. And then we see a whole development of humanistic thought in the 17th and 18th century. I shall now speak somewhat about the history of this thought, the further development, to make this idea of humanism, humanity, somewhat more specific and concrete to you in the words of the great thinkers of this time. I mean of the time of the 17th and 18th century. I want to mention Spinoza only briefly. He is really the father of modern scientific psychology because he constructed a model of man, a model of human nature. And he deducted the laws, or used the laws of this model of human nature in a scientific manner. One might dispute the correctness of his conclusions, but he was the man who saw a model of man which was universal, which did not refer to any specific nation and culture, and he saw the problem of human existence as one which is common to all men, and laws which are common to all men. For Spinoza, activity and passivity, virtue and sin, if you please, they all flow from the same laws which are inherent in that which is in that existence which is common to all men. Let me say a word about Leibniz here, because he is very important with regard to one special problem, and that is that the 18th century thought that only by expressing and unfolding one's full individuality can man reach the experience of human universality. We are prone today to believe that the less individual we are, the more we are together, the more we share. And so everybody tries to smooth himself out to the minimum of individuality, hoping in this way to become the sheep which cannot be distinguished from all the other sheep. The 18th century had the opposite idea, that precisely by developing our own individual self to its fullest potential, that precisely by doing this, we experience that humanity which is common to all of us. That there is no experience of universal humanity by equalization of men, by the doing away with their individuality, but on the contrary, that only then can I feel as one of all if I first have become fully myself. Leibniz said, in our own being is contained a germ, a footprint, a symbol of the divine nature and its true image. Now that expresses in a spiritual religious language, again the same idea which I quoted from Nicholas of Cusa. And I want to read you here a comment which Ernst Cassirer makes in his book. I shall later, next time, give you a list of books which I would recommend of this whole topic, where Cassirer says, it's in the Philosophy of Enlightenment, this means that only the highest development of all individual energies, not their leveling, equalization, or extinction, leads to the truth of being, to the highest harmony, and the most intensive fullness of reality. Now, in the Enlightenment of the 18th century until the beginning of the 19th century, it is not quite easy, and certainly not in 1 hour or in what seems to be another 15 minutes or so, to give you a picture of the development of the idea of humanity. It may be said that in general, as they often are called, the philosopher of enlightenment, and actually it's kind of unfair to the Germans because the German philosophers have a very important part in all this. But let us say specifically the French philosophers indeed, had a concept of man which was, as we would say, optimistic. They believed that man was natively good, easily enlightened, disposed to follow reason and common sense, generous, humane, and tolerant. Today, this optimistic mood is considered in many enlightened circles as a particularly vicious sin. Dr. Niebuhr and many others emphasize the fact that man is so sinful and so evil, and hence that this optimistic mood is irresponsible. Well, I think anyone who is blind will not indulge today in the optimistic mood of the philosopher of the Enlightenment. Anyone who isn't deaf can hear the roaring of these beautiful missiles which go to the moon or in the atmosphere and know that all these missiles are preparations for the big catastrophe and are not born out of man's inspiration for the higher life. I think for anyone who wants to hear and to see, we don't need to emphasize that unfortunately the optimism of the 18th century was somewhat exaggerated. I think that by now is pretty clear, and it isn't worth making so much noise about the fact that this optimistic picture was wrong. What is remarkable is that the 18th century had believed, and we haven't. It had believed in man and its possibilities, even if it saw the road a little too simple. And speaking about belief in man, I want to quote Goethe here, because Goethe said one of the, as I believe, most significant things about history. He says, there's only one I'm not quoting literally now, but it's more or less so. There's only one significant distinction between historical periods, and that is the distinction between periods who have belief and the periods which have no belief. Those who have belief are flourishing and growing, and those who have lost belief are decaying and dying. It is quite clear, the 13th century and the 18th century, and as I shall try to show, to some limited extent the 19th century, were still periods of belief. And we live in an age in which there is no belief. And probably for this reason there is so much hate. Now I should like to quote you simply a number of statements from various philosophers to give you a more concrete idea of the concept of human nature, of humanity. Hume says, mankind are so much the same in all times and places that history informs of nothing new or strange in this particular. Its chief use is only to discover the constant and universal principles of human nature. Now in Rousseau you find a distinction which is very important, and for this reason I just want to quote you one sentence. He says, we should distinguish between the variety in human nature and that which is essential to it. Now this is very important. If one speaks of the essence of man, or what is the essence of humanity, or what is human, that one can distinguish between that which is, which varies, which is a specific expression of humanity in various cultures, in various historical periods, and that which is essential. That is to say, that without which one cannot speak about humanity. As I shall, I think, mention later, Marx made this difference, speaking about human nature in general, which is precisely that which Rousseau calls the essential of human nature, and human nature as it is formed and expressed in various cultures. Of course, we never see human nature in general directly. We only see men in various forms in which they appear, and that means already in various manifestations of this human nature. And yet the aim of Rousseau, the aim of Marx, the aim of many philosophers was to infer what is the essence of man from the various manifestations of it, and to discuss the question whether this is only a logical, theoretical, scientific inference, or whether we can also experience directly and not theoretically humanity in ourselves. Whether there is something which permits us to say without nonsense that a person is inhuman, that an act is inhuman. If we say such a thing and do not use simply poetic, symbolic language, then indeed we must assume there is something which is human. Otherwise there could be nothing that is inhuman. Well, in Holbach, for instance, who was an atheist and who was one of the philosophers, you find the same concept applied to morality. The morality, he speaks of the morality suitable to man should be founded on the nature of man. And that's an idea then which you find again and again in the following development. Now, these ideas have had a great influence on the on American tradition through Locke and then Jefferson. In order to understand, says Locke, what government ought to be, one has only to consult the nature of man. That is to say, for him, the right government is a government which corresponds to the need of man, and this need of man can be, these needs of man can be understood if we know the nature of man. I want now to quote some of the German philosophers who in many ways differ from the French philosophers which I have quoted so far, namely Herder, Lessing, and Goethe. I want to quote from Herder, who says that man, in contrast to the animal, is born feeble and never reaches fully the aim of his organization. He must develop in himself humanity, the artificial instinct of reason, humanity, human mode of living. Excuse me. I'm sorry, I cannot read my own handwriting here. But I think the meaning of it is nevertheless so far clear. He says, specifically human is the highest flowering of natural evolution. That is to say, the concept there is that in natural evolution, we find in man that which is specifically human. In other words, that which transcends the animal kingdom. That is the highest flowering of human evolution. Lessing considers it a task of man to realize, or the realization of the essence of the human species. This is the aim. The aim of history is precisely the realization of the essence of the human species. And that is not different basically from the prophetic concept, from the Christian concept. Namely, that man has an aim, and this aim is to become what he potentially is. The aim is to realize his own humanity, and there is no other aim. And very interestingly, Lessing called this stage in which man would perfect his humanity the Third Reich. And this has happened within about 100 years in the very same Germany, that one of the great German thinkers had it called the Third Reich, the Reich in which man perfects his essence. And 100 years later, a man called the Third Reich, the Reich of complete inhumanity. Let me now quote you some things from Goethe, who unfortunately is relatively little known in the English-speaking world, and yet who is really, I believe, one of the greatest thinkers in human history and one of the greatest representatives of humanism. For Goethe's view was that man carries in himself not only his own individuality, but all humanity with all its potentialities, although because of the limitations of his existence, he can realize only a part of his potentialities. You can see how close this is to what Leibniz said, to what Nicholas of Cusa said. Man in himself is humanity, but it is the tragic dichotomy of his existence that in the short time of his life, and with all the forces which operate against his unfolding, he can realize only a small part of humanity in himself. The question is, and here we would continue, the question is that although we might not realize, we might not bring to its manifestations all the potential of humanity in ourselves, whether we can nevertheless experience this humanity, whether we can nevertheless experience all that is human in us, whether we can experience what Terence called that nothing human can be alien to us, that I am all of humanity. I am the saint and I am the criminal. I am the child and I am the old man. And I am a member of the human race 100,000 years ago. And I am a man who could live 100,000 years from now in an entirely different world. And still I am man, and all is in you. The perhaps greatest expression which Goethe has given to the idea of humanity is to be found in his drama Iphigenia on Taurus. Originally, there is a Greek drama by Euripides, Iphigenia among the Taurians. Now the story is briefly that Iphigenia, the daughter of Agamemnon, was to be sacrificed to the gods in order to get better wind for the ships when they sailed to Troy. And but actually the gods were merciful, and she was not killed, but she was transported to the island of Taurus, which was however an island of barbarians, ruled by King Thoas. Now these barbarians had a rule to kill every stranger who was stranded there. But when Iphigenia arrived, the king changed his ways. He makes her a priestess in the temple. He ceases to kill the strangers who are stranded at the island. He becomes human. Human in many ways, also in the way that he falls in love with Iphigenia and wants to marry her. But she does not want to marry him. She wants to return to Greece. Well, now, then her brother Orestes and his friend are stranded in Taurus, and the king wants to kill them. So far, Euripides' Iphigenia and Goethe's Iphigenia are pretty much the same. In fact, they are the same up to another point. Orestes suggests that they should steal the image of the goddess, of Artemis, I think, that they should all run away, and in the Greek tragedy they do it. And at first, in Goethe's Iphigenia, they decide to do that too. Because Iphigenia is confronted with a choice between what one calls today a greater and a lesser evil. The greater evil is probably that she, her brother, and her friend will be killed. And the lesser evil is that she will have to deceive the man who has been kind to her and has confidence in her. Well, I guess most people wouldn't even find today that there is any problem. But if again you find there is a problem, and Goethe too. And she decided first to choose the lesser evil. Now, if I could say as a footnote, many people decide to choose the lesser evil, and they do not see that if they choose the lesser evil, it takes only more time until they arrive more certainly at the bigger evil. And then Iphigenia has an entirely new insight to be. She sees a new possibility. She sees the possibility of telling the truth to the king, of appealing to this barbarian with a voice of truth and humanity. Now I said before, when I told you the story of the Grand Canyon, that there is a similarity between the Grand Canyon and Iphigenia. Namely, there is a choice. And if Iphigenia refuses to accept both alternatives, namely that of killing her brother and of deceiving the king, because between two evils you cannot choose, it makes no sense from the standpoint of Goethe's humanism. But then you must begin to think, is there another possibility? And even if that other possibility seems to be impossible, still it has to be seized, because the other alternatives are evil and do not lead to anything which makes life worthwhile living. And she tells the king the truth, and the king says to us, and dost thou think that the uncultured Scythian will attend the voice of truth and of humanity, which Atreus the Greek heard not? And Iphigenia answers, it's heard by everyone born beneath whatever clime, within whose bosom flows the stream of life, pure and unhindered. Well, this was Goethe's concept of humanity. This was Goethe's concept of the supernatural experience of the voice of truth and the voice of humanity. And this was his belief that there is always a possibility that the voice of humanity will reach the other person. But if the voice of humanity is not heard anymore, there is no more chance. I want to read you now, it will take only a few more minutes. I want to read you something which Goethe says about patriotism and nationalism, because there is so much talk now about the importance of unification of Germany, and there are a few things which Goethe, who was certainly one of the greatest Germans who ever lived, has to say about this topic. He says in 1814, now mind you, that is precisely during the so-called liberation wars of the Germans against Napoleon. The German nation is nothing, but the individual German is something, and yet they imagine the opposite to be true. The Germans should be dispersed throughout the world like the Jews, in order fully to develop all the good that is in them for the benefit of mankind. Well, this is written in 1799, that is before the German liberation movement. At a time when everyone is busy creating new fatherlands, the fatherland of the man who thinks without prejudice and can rise above his time is nowhere and everywhere. And when Napoleon came to Weimar after his defeat of Leipzig in the German so-called Liberation War, Goethe received him decorated with the Legion d'Honneur. And of course he was denounced by many as a traitor to his country. Another statement by Goethe, 1814, again after the Battle of Leipzig. Our young people find it most convenient to join the forces, he means the armed forces fighting against Napoleon, and just become as much of a nuisance as other honest people have been to us. It is a very enticing occupation, especially as it allows one to gain the reputation of being an accomplished patriot. Or in 1827, that was when nationalism had already won in Germany, and when men like Hegel and Fichte had already been converted to the new nationalism, Goethe wrote, national literature has now become a meaningless term. The era of world literature is fast approaching, and everyone must strive to hasten its progress. And then it said, I'm sorry, I do not have the date, but it's, I think about the same time. He says, especially in Germany, we are advancing rapidly toward barbarism, and the situation is not much better in France. The end of it all will be despotism amidst the ruins. In 50 years, or probably much earlier, free institutions and a free press will have completely disappeared in the whole of Europe, at least in continental countries. Now, this is actually Goethe's alternative, and in fact he didn't even put in terms of alternative, he put in terms of a prophecy, that Europe is approaching the age of barbarism. Other people have the foresight to believe in that. Goethe saw it very clearly, and it is quite clear that for Goethe the alternative was precisely the humanism of which he was talking in Iphigenia and the barbarism in which the sense of humanity gets lost. Well, I'll stop here. We'll have a pause of 10 minutes. In the meantime, questions are written down, will be collected, and then after 10 minutes we'll have some time for discussion. And next time, in the next lecture, I will speak about the anti-humanist reaction in the 19th century and the reaction, the new humanist reaction to that and to some other problems which are related to our topic. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.